Welcome. We're very pleased to have Jenna Russell and Scott Helman here for today's very timely Chat with Champions. This will be a good time to silence your cell phones, pagers, or anything else that might make noise. The chat series sponsor is the First, 223 Main Street in Damariscotta, a community bank that serves customers at 16 branches along Maine's coast. I want to thank our partners, Maine Coast Bookshop and Lincoln Theater. Our presenters will be generously signing copies of their book, Long Mile Home, in the theater lobby immediately following the chat. Today, I've asked someone who was there on April 15th, 2013, to introduce our speakers. Stephen Reed is a retired Wisconsin physician who has run at least 3 miles a day since 1976. Last month, he completed his 26th consecutive Boston Marathon. Steve?
Thank you, Betty. As she mentioned, I'm Steve Reed, and I also would like to welcome you to the Chats with Champions. I grew up here in Damariscotta, and I can recall coming to the movies for the huge amount of 25 cents. Those times have long gone by. As Betty had mentioned, I had a family practice in Wisconsin for 32 years. That was my vocation, and my avocation was and is recreational and competitive running. And as Betty had mentioned, I have the daily streak, which I can't let go, and the consecutive Boston marathons that I also can't let go in spite of a bad hip that logically should be repaired. But anyway, that's another story altogether. Speaking of the marathons, I was there for the year of the bombings, and I was marching up Heartbreak Hill, which is about mile 20. And another runner came along and said that she had heard that there were 2 bombs that had gone off at the finish line. And I looked at her and I said, well, which one of us is on crack cocaine? Because I just was in total disbelief. But sure enough, a mile later, they had stopped the race and they were taking us off the road. And they housed us at a building on the Boston College campus for about 3 hours while they were sorting everything out. Finally, they bussed us into downtown Boston, and I've never seen as many police and guns in one place. It was just incredible. I still am in total disbelief about that event. Just the concept of mankind doing that kind of thing to other individuals. But I also believe that the Boston Marathon has come back even stronger than ever, in spite of the residual emotional, physical trauma. So we are very fortunate today to have 2 individuals who have written a book on that nefarious event, Long Mile Home, etc., etc. And Jenna Russell is an award-winning journalist at the Boston Globe and a co-author of the book. She's a New York Times bestseller, Last Lion, the Globe's 2009 biography of Senator Edward Kennedy. She recently worked on 68 Blocks, Life, Death, Hope, a groundbreaking series about life in one of Boston's most violent neighborhoods, and she was one of the reporters at the forefront of the Globe's coverage of the marathon bombing. Scott Helman is a staff writer at the Boston Globe Sunday magazine and co-author of The Real Romney, a critically acclaimed biography of 2012 Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney. He was previously the Globe's political editor and a national political reporter, serving as a lead writer on the 2008 presidential campaign. So without further ado, I will turn the proceedings over to Jenna and Scott.
be back in Maine. I spent some very happy years working in the 90s for the Bangor Daily News and had the privilege of roaming all over this beautiful state, reporting mostly on the arts. And so it's a thrill for me to be here in this fabulous theater and to talk a little bit with all of you about these events that really, I think, affected all of us in different ways. We usually like to start with just a short reading from the book. This is from the second part of the book, where we pick up the story after that very tumultuous week in April 2013 and try to tell about the journey of the city and the survivors going forward. And this chapter is called A City Reborn, and it describes what went on at the memorial that sprang up after the bombing in Copley Square, very close by, kind of a spontaneous gathering spot. It began with a handful of small American flags tucked into the barriers that blocked off Boylston Street. Almost by the hour, in those first uncertain days after the bombing, the makeshift memorial grew, becoming strangely powerful and enduring, a place of pilgrimage and reflection for the thousands of people who flocked to Copley Square. It was as if by getting close, by breathing the air, they might understand what had happened there. Many felt compelled to leave a token, some symbol of their grief or solidarity. And so the bouquet of flags became, too, a rising pile of race medals, candles, and rosary beads. It swelled with running shoes and baseball caps and arrangements of fresh spring flowers, purple irises and yellow daffodils and white lilies. It became, as the days went by, a free-form shrine adorned with hockey pucks, a bag of Boston baked beans candy, and clamshells bearing messages like "Boston will run again." Everything had a place: the stuffed Wisconsin badger, the elf figurines, and the quilt of handwritten note cards left by visitors from around the world. Houston loves Boston. Greece loves Boston. Tibet stands with Boston. Columbia is with Boston. We will not submit. May the light outshine the darkness.
So let me talk a little bit about how this book came about and sort of how it fits into the Globe's work. So in case this isn't clear, Jenna and I are both reporters for the Globe, and this is very much a Globe project. This was a book that was commissioned by our editors in a desire to tell this incredible story to a kind of a wider audience. And this is something that we have been doing more and more in recent years at the Globe. We realize that there are people and events and issues that require or deserve kind of a broader telling than we can just do in the pages of the newspaper. And so a few years ago, Jenna co-wrote a biography on Ted Kennedy in the last days and weeks of his life. And the idea there was that here was somebody who had this enormous influence over American politics and policy, certainly a polarizing figure over his many years of public life, and we knew him better than anybody else because he's sort of our guy, right? We have covered him, the good and the bad and everything between, for years and years and years, and sort of who better to tell that story than us? And so that became a book called Last Line, which was this great independent biography of Kennedy that came out just as he was dying. A few years later, we applied the same logic to Mitt Romney. Here was somebody who, had a pretty good chance of being president, and yet a lot of the country, a lot of the world didn't know that much about him, except we did, because he had been in Boston for years, first as an executive and consultant, and then later, of course, as a governor. And so we applied that same logic. We know him better than anybody else. We see it as our duty, in a sense, to tell the world about who this man is and what makes him tick and what kind of president he might be, and what in his past that we could draw on to have a sense of what he would do in the future. And so I co-wrote a biography on him called The Real Romney, and that became, during the 2012 presidential cycle, kind of a Bible, if you will, on his life. A couple of colleagues of ours, Kevin Cullen and Shelley Murphy, a couple of years ago wrote a big book on Whitey Bulger, same idea, right? Here was somebody we had tracked for years and years. He was on the FBI's most wanted list when he was caught and brought to trial. This was, very much a Boston story, but it was bigger than that. So we decided to tell it in book form. And so, of course, the marathon, I don't have to tell any of you, you know that it was pretty apparent within really just minutes of that happening that this was a huge story and one that was not just about Boston or affected Boston, but people all over the world. And so not long after it happened, we got together and said, well, is this the kind of story that we want to bring to light in book form? Is there a book here? Again, do we feel an obligation to tell this story in a bigger way? And it became clear that the answer to that was yes. And so we started talking about how we would do that. And there are lots of different ways that you can approach a book like this. I mean, needless to say, it was a very sensitive thing to do because in order to put it out reasonably quickly, we had to start on it reasonably quickly. So that means you're talking to people who are really deeply affected by something not long after that thing has happened. And that made for some unique challenges that we can talk a little bit about later. But I think as Jenna and I started to talk about what kind of book made the most sense, we both came to the conclusion that we wanted the book to be more than just a retelling of these horrible hours and these horrible days and this tragedy. We wanted it to not just be a tick-tock of kind of what happened, in part because everybody kind of knows that, and I also think that that's not really a satisfying book. In the end, you want a book to be about more than that, and so we set out here to make this book really about people and to root the narrative in individual experiences that would together tell you the larger story of what it was like to go through not just that day, but that week and then the weeks afterward. And so that's what we did. We talked a lot about the characters that the kinds of characters that we would want to follow, and who were the people that if we brought them together, if we stitched their stories together, would kind of illuminate the whole thing. And so ultimately we settled on 5 core characters that form the center of this book, and what we do throughout the book is follow them throughout, again, the kind of the week and then the weeks afterward. And I'll let Jenna talk a little bit about each one of them, and she'll give you a sense of kind of how they knit together again to bring you these various perspectives.
So as Scott and I began to talk in May or June of 2013 about how the book would take shape, we certainly had kind of an ideal vision of what we might be able to achieve. And a lot of these, there was no guarantee that we would be able to connect with the right people to make these things happen. But we knew that if we could, it would be very important to try and tell the story of one of the survivors who was most deeply affected by the bombing. And as you all know, there were 17 people who lost either one or both legs. And many of them were in no way ready to begin talking with us about their story at the point when we were reaching out. So we did we wrote a lot of letters to people. We tried very hard to express clearly why we were doing the book, what kind of book we wanted it to be. And eventually, we were very fortunate to connect with a young woman named Heather Abbott, who is in her 30s, and she's from Newport, Rhode Island, and she would go every year to the marathon with a close group of friends of hers. They would always go to the Red Sox game first that morning, Patriots Day, and then they would walk over to the finish line on Boylston Street to watch the runners coming in the afternoon. And Heather had just arrived on Boylston Street that day, and she was standing just outside the door of a restaurant there called Forum with a couple of her friends when she heard the first explosion down the street and turned to look. And then, of course, just seconds later, the second bomb exploded just feet away from her. She was thrown through the door, inside, obviously a great deal of chaos. And she knew that something terrible had happened and that something terrible had happened to her. And Heather, when I connected with her early on, I found that for different reasons very personal to her, she did feel strongly, even very soon after, that telling her story was something that she felt could be good for her personally and also could be good for the community at large. And so we began a series of conversations, and I found her to be just to have a remarkable story to tell. Scott and I didn't realize when we first connected with her how unusual her circumstances were. In fact, Heather got to the hospital that day and went straight into surgery like so many others. But in Heather's case, surgeons were actually able to save a badly damaged left foot and leg that night. And so in the morning, she woke up on Tuesday, and suddenly Heather thought that she had been one of the lucky ones who had been spared the fate of an amputee. And over the course of the week, her condition deteriorated, and in the end, Heather faced a really unimaginable choice where doctors came to her and said that she could choose to go forward and to live a compromised life with a foot and a leg that would never allow her to run again, that would never allow her to walk, to limp. She would probably suffer from chronic pain for the rest of her life. Or she can make a different choice and decide to amputate the leg and try to forge a different path. And Heather's a very practical person. She's a very kind of research-oriented. She did a great deal of research in order to make a decision. It was ultimately to choose amputation, to really almost embrace that choice and commit herself to moving forward from the day of that surgery, 1 week after the marathon, and trying to reclaim the life that she had, and she believed, and still does, that she would have a better chance of reclaiming that life, making the choice that she made. So for us, it was a true privilege and gift to be able to chronicle that decision, and also to document Heather's path forward. For although we had some very ambitious deadlines, as Scott alluded to, we tried really hard to push against the deadlines and to be there with these people as they move forward, so that we could capture those events and make them part of the story. And Heather was a fabulous choice for that. So Heather really is, in some ways, the very heart of the narrative in the book. And this is, excuse me, Dr. David King.
He's the one on the left.
Thank you, Scott. Very helpful. So, Dr. King is a trauma surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital. He is also an Army surgeon who had served time in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And he's also an avid marathoner. And he ran the race that day in 2013, ran it pretty quickly. I think it was just over 3 hours that he finished. He met up with his family at the finish line, and they headed home to Cambridge. He was just driving home, and he began receiving text messages on his phone telling him that something had gone wrong. And he rushed inside, grabbed a pair of scrubs and a banana, and he went straight to the hospital, where he immediately began operating on some of the most severely injured patients.
Which hospital were they taking people to?
I'm sorry?
Which hospital were they taking people to?
So they were taking people to all of the level 1 hospitals that, very fortunately for us, were located, many of them, very close to the finish line. So they kind of have a system in place where they distribute them as evenly as they can to the hospitals that are equipped to take them, so that no one place is completely overwhelmed. And that's kind of how it played out. So for that reason, many families weren't able to figure out exactly where their family members were for quite some time, because there were actually a number of really specialized places where they could go. And a lot of people credit that with saving a lot of lives that day, that this was a pretty fortunate place for something like this to happen.
Could you speak up, please?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Let me lean in here. So Dr. King, it was important to us to try and tell the story of that medical response that day because it was so crucial to the way that things played out. And as you all know, there were 3 people who were killed at the finish line. But what is really remarkable is that the death toll did not creep higher in the hours and the days that followed. Many of us kept waiting for that to happen given the severity of the injuries there. And it didn't happen, and I think that the location, the number of hospitals, the number of really excellent surgeons that we have was the reason for that. So Dr. King allowed us to really open up a window on that medical response, go inside it, and hear what it was like from the point of view of someone who was there at the hospital in the operating room. And here in the front row in the flowered dress is Krystle Campbell, one of the victims that day. And again, we hoped very much to be able to tell her story in the book. We didn't know if that would be possible, given how traumatized her family was. And fortunately, we were able to connect with them, to do a little bit of work with her parents, and to do a lot more work with some of Krystle's close friends and colleagues and people who knew her. And to try as best we could to really capture who she was. She was a very effervescent person, very charismatic, extremely generous, quietly did many acts to help other people, and made quite an impact in the short time that she had. And so that felt like a very important core mission for us to try and tell that story. And here is Dave McGillivray, the director of the Boston Marathon, which we saw the race as being a character itself in this story, right at the heart of the story. A very, very special event, as I'm sure many of you know. Just very dear to the city and the region. A super special day in the city of Boston, a very family-oriented day. It's almost a celebration of spring and of the city itself. And in bringing him into the story, again, we were able to go behind the scenes and show the incredible complexity of putting this race together every year, this very historic race, just internationally known. And he also just happens to be a really interesting guy with a great personal story, a very gifted storyteller in his own right. So again, a choice that allowed us to open up another vein of storytelling. And this is Shayna Katong, a very young Boston police officer in her 20s at the time of the marathon. Shayna grew up in New York City, and she was a teenager when 9/11 happened and was very deeply affected by those events. And she told us that one of the reasons that she fell in love with Boston when she came there to go to college at Northeastern was because she felt so safe in Boston compared to how she had always felt in New York after 9/11. Shayna was working a detail at the finish line. She was in between the sites of the 2 explosions when they happened. Shayna I first spoke with just days after the bombing and had a long conversation with her while she was actually driving home to New York to see her dad and to try and take some time. I was very struck immediately by her raw honesty. Shayna wasn't afraid to tell me that she was very, very scared there on Boylston Street that day. She wasn't afraid to tell me that she felt like the effects of this had gone very deep for her and that she would be dealing with them for a long, long time to come. I really valued that, and so I sought her out later on when we started to put the book together. And it was a tough decision for Shayna to decide to go deeper into her story, and it took her a long time to figure that out. But in the end, she decided it was something that honesty could help other people, to know that they weren't alone in their struggles with these events. So again, just incredibly fortunate, feel very privileged to have worked with her and to be able to tell the story. She sprang into action that day. She was on the ground with some people who were very, very close to losing their lives. She was instrumental in actually flagging down a police van in the absence of enough ambulances to carry patients. She leaped into the back of the van to the pitch black with two people who had probably just minutes to live and got them to Mass General, where both of their lives were saved. And these, of course, are faces that you probably know at this point, the Tsarnaev brothers. It was never really a question for us as journalists that they would be part of this book and that we would attempt to tell their story as well. There are questions here that, of course, we're never going to have complete answers to as to why something like this could happen, why anyone would want to undertake this kind of action. But with the support of very gifted colleagues, including our longtime Moscow bureau chief, David Filipov, who traveled twice to Dagestan in the summer of 2013 to probe their family history there. We put together a chapter in the book where we tried to, as best we could, describe their journey, how and why they came to this country about 10 years before the bombing, and what went wrong when they got here that caused just a complete collapse of their family in every possible way. The city of Boston is another entity that we consider to be a character in this story. I'm sure all of you are well familiar with the ways that the city tried to come together in the wake of this tragedy, and where people reached out, raised incredible amounts of money to help survivors. And it was a very particular time with a very particular feeling. And we felt that it was important throughout the book, in addition to telling these 5 core stories, to capture some of the everyday people who were swept up into these events in different ways, very unexpectedly, from the gentleman in Watertown who went out to check on his boat and discovered a terrorist hiding in it, to the people at the finish line who are not trained medics or law enforcement officers, but didn't run away and knelt there and helped to save lives themselves. Scott's going to read a little bit from from the stories of one of those individuals, somebody whose story you may have heard by now, who we call Danny.
So if you read the papers in the weeks after the bombing, one of the most dramatic stories was the tale of this guy named Danny, who was a young Chinese-born engineer living in Cambridge, who had been carjacked by the brothers and taken on this very harrowing, I think it was 90-minute ride around the city. And another one of our colleagues, Eric Moskowitz, did a terrific story on him and helped find him in the weeks afterward. And I'm going to read a little bit from a chapter of the book where Danny relays his story and the kind of terror of that night for him. "It's not so easy," Danny replied when Tamerlan first told him to start driving. He was nervous, his hands shaking. He could barely control the wheel, the car veering out of the lane. Tamerlan, not wanting to draw attention, told him to relax. "Drive like nothing happened," he told him in a calming voice. "Play it cool." Danny's heart was pounding. "Just don't kill me," he thought. "Don't hurt me." They continued west. Tamerlan asked Danny where he was from. "I'm Chinese," he said, thinking it might help to emphasize that he was not American. "Okay, you're Chinese," Tamerlan said. "I'm a Muslim American." "Chinese are very friendly to Muslims," Danny assured him. "We are so friendly to Muslims." As they talked, Danny cast himself as a recent immigrant with no friends and limited command of English. He apologized for his halting speech. In truth, he was hiding behind that self-portrait, trying to buy time to strategize. Trained as an engineer, he made scrupulous mental notes of street signs and passing details, even as he abided Tamerlan's command not to study his face. "Don't look at me," Tamerlan shouted at one point. "Do you remember my face?" No, I don't remember anything," he said. Tamerlan laughed. "It's like white guys. They look at black guys and think all black guys look the same," he said. "Maybe you think all white guys look the same." "Exactly," Danny said, even though he thought nothing of the sort. It was one of many moments in their strange conversational chess match, Danny playing up his outsider status, playing down his wealth. He claimed the car was older than it was, and he understated his lease payments. And Tamerlan trying to make Danny feel sufficiently at ease so he wouldn't do anything to draw attention to the car. When Tamerlan asked him what he was doing in the United States, Danny didn't tell him he had a job, in part because he didn't want Tamerlan to think he had any close relationships with people. People who might feel worried about Danny's whereabouts and call the police. He feared might drive Tamerlan to do something rash. Better to figure his own way out of this, he thought. So we told Tamerlan he had just finished a graduate degree at Northeastern and been in the U.S. only 18 months. Oh, Tamerlan said, that's why your English is not very good. It seemed to help that Tamerlan even had trouble with Danny's pronunciation of the word China. In truth, Danny had come to the U.S. in 2009 for a master's degree, graduated in January of 2012, and returned to China to await a work visa. He came back in early 2013, leasing a Mercedes, moving into a high-rise with 2 Chinese friends, diving into his work at a startup. Eventually, Tamerlan put the gun on the armrest, satisfied that Danny was behaving as directed. He asked for the PIN for Danny's ATM card. Danny contemplated giving him a fake one, but thought better of it. When he told Tamerlan his PIN, Tamerlan asked him if the number was his birthday. It was really the birthday of Danny's close friend, but Danny didn't want him to think he had any friends, lest Tamerlan think someone was waiting for him. So he told Tamerlan it was his girlfriend's birthday, and that his girlfriend lived in China. Does anyone care about you? Tamerlan asked him. There is no one who cares about me, Danny. So as Jenna said, there are, of course, these 5 characters that we follow along with the brothers, but there really are so many people like Danny who played a kind of bit role in this, some of them very important. In Danny's case, he was the one, after he escaped their car at a gas station in Cambridge, he was the one that ran, called the police, and eventually was the reason the police were able to link up with the brothers, because Danny's car had GPS, and Danny told them, call Mercedes, tell them my name, they will find the car, and sure enough, that's what they did. I'm going to run through a few pictures now that will give you a sense of some of the other characters and certainly some of the iconic images that we remember from that week. Some of them are familiar to you, some of them may not be.
Am I blocking the screen for some of you? Because I can get out of the way. How do I do that? No, you're fine. Are you sure? Over here?
So this is a photo taken by our colleague John Tamaki, which became kind of the iconic image of the bombing. 3 policemen hovering in confusion over a runner named Bill Ifrig from Washington State, I believe, who was not badly injured, but he was blown down in the force of the blast. This is Carlos Arredondo in the cowboy hat, helping Jeff Bauman in the wheelchair. Jeff was one of only a few double amputees from the bombing, very badly hurt, and Carlos played a key role in getting him to the ambulance that day. The scene on Boylston Street, in the moments after the bombings as they raced to save lives. This is a remarkable photo. Those of you who know anything about marathons know that marathons just go, right? They don't stop, you never stop them. The history of the Boston Marathon have never ever been halted. And this is an event, that had started before World War I, right? And never stopped until 2013. And this is the scene near the Mass Ave Bridge, very close to the finish line. Where they had to halt the race. And, a lot of the runners, you think about what this does to you. You train for months or even years to do this. You're at, I forget what mile this is, it's like 25, it's very close. And you're told you can't continue. And at first there was a lot of anger and a lot of frustration and just sort of disbelief that this was happening. And then, of course, gradually as people learn what happened, that the full sense of the tragedy and gravity of what's taken place since then. This is the scene outside Boston Medical Center. Jenna alluded to this with talking about David King, but it really is an incredible thing. If you think about the force of these blasts and the damage they were designed to do, it's remarkable that only 3 people were killed on the street that day, and that not a single person who was brought to a hospital died. And again, if this would have been anywhere else, if this would have been even in Hopkinton, right, at the start line, instead of in downtown Boston, near all these amazing hospitals, we would have been talking about a much, much higher death toll. But it's a real testament to the the amazing medical establishment in the city that nobody brought to any one of those facilities died. And then, of course, the pictures of the victims, which are still hard to see this many 2 years later. Martin Richard, Lindsay Liu, the graduate student at BU. This is a picture of Krystle Campbell's mother, Patty, and her brother, Billy. This is a vigil It was held in a park in Dorchester soon after the bombing. And then the memorial that grew up on Copley Square. Some of you have probably seen it. It was quite a sight if you didn't. First in the street, and then it moved to the kind of the park in Copley Square, and it was just this amazing collection of stuff and really beautiful notes and personal messages from people and rosaries and pictures and all kinds of crazy stuff. And it became really a site of pilgrimage. And then we get to Thursday, which in some ways is, I mean, each one of the days that week was crazy in its own right. Thursday started with this kind of tense arrival by President Obama to this interfaith service in Boston. These guys were still on the loose. We didn't know exactly how many or who did it or why. And then over the course of that day, this is the afternoon that the FBI puts out the surveillance video or images for the first time of the brothers. And then, of course, that day only gets even crazier and more sad as the brothers kill Sean Collier, a police officer for MIT, while he's sitting in his cruiser. And then during a wild firefight in Watertown early Friday morning, Richard Donahue, a police officer for the MBTA, is gravely wounded. He's shot in the thigh and he nearly dies on the street, and his life is saved. Really, he was right on the brink, but his life was saved. And in fact, just yesterday, for the first time, he went, some of you may have seen this, he went back to work on the 4th, which is quite a day. I exchanged emails with his wife yesterday, actually, and she was, as you can imagine, saying this was an incredibly wonderful day for them, but also a scary one for her, because the last time he was on duty, he nearly lost his life. This is the scene in Watertown, which was just as surreal as you can get. I mean, the entire city was shut down. Nobody was on the streets except for like SWAT teams and policemen. And that, more than anything, I think was a day for most of us who lived in that area, was the day you really remember, just because it was so eerie to have everything been completely shut down and not know where this kid was hiding. And I think this picture, I love this picture by Bill Green, our colleague at the Globe, because it really captures the dynamic that day. If you were in Watertown, right, where he was thought to be hiding, at once you were really interested in what was happening, but also really scared. So you saw, as you walked around the streets that day, people kind of doing this in and out of windows, like they were really curious of what was going on, and there's, you know, every manner of police vehicle racing by at fast speeds. But you're also kind of wary because you don't know, maybe he's on my roof, maybe he's in my basement. I think this picture really captures that push-pull beautifully. And then, of course, that night, David Henneberry, retired boat lover in Watertown, goes out to his boat and knows that something is awry and the tarp is messed up, and he gets up and he sees that more than just the tarp is messed up, there's in fact a body in his boat. And so he runs back in and calls police, which brings to conclusion this wild week at last. This is a photo of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev being brought to the hospital after he was apprehended. And then the incredible sense of jubilation that night at about 8:45 p.m. when it was finally the sense that this week was over. Though, of course, it was over for most people, but not for everyone. And we'll talk a little bit a little more about that in a minute. And in the weeks and months that followed, there was a real, I think, effort by everyone to try to get back to normal and to try to kind of reclaim the city and so forth. And this is a photo of Heather Abbott after her amputation, throwing out the first pitch at Fenway Park, and she talks really eloquently about feeling the weight of this moment, knowing that the city is looking upon her to kind of show that she's okay, right? And she can get out at Fenway Park and put a baseball cap on and throw a ball to home plate. It was a pretty good ball, too.
She did well.
She made it.
It's kind of a great story about Heather on that day, which I think was about sometime in late May, maybe about 6 weeks after the bombing. And she had been staying at Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital in Boston, and she, received the invitation from the Red Sox, and she was excited about it, but she was very, very nervous about going out there in front of all of these people. And at one point, as the day grew closer, she said to one of her physical therapists, you know, I'm thinking maybe I should why don't I just roll out there in my wheelchair and throw the ball? And her physical therapist really yelled at her, Heather, absolutely not. You're not going to go roll out there in your wheelchair. Everybody needs to see that you're doing okay. She accepted that, and she, as Scott said, she made it out there, and this was also a great day for her because when she left Fenway that day, she actually was going home from the hospital. So that afternoon, she went back to her home in Newport, Rhode Island for the first time since that morning, early morning, when she had one of her friends had come and picked her up to go to the marathon. So it was a very emotional day, a very happy day, but at the same time, for her walking back into that world that she had left was hard and reminded her in many ways of what she had lost and how much things had changed since she left. She went into her bedroom that day, and there's a pile of boxes or packages waiting for her on her bed that someone had brought inside for her, and she looked at them and realized that what it was actually a number of pairs of like summer shoes and summer dresses that she had ordered before the marathon that had arrived while she was in the hospital. When she saw them there and realized, you know, that that life was gone to her. It was, Heather's not a big crier. She doesn't cry often, but she broke down at that point. And really cried for everything that had changed and changed forever. Heather, I mentioned, you know, that Heather's story was such a gift to us. One other way in which we benefited greatly from it was that by chance, Heather turned out to be one of the survivors, one of the amputees who made the most rapid progress forward. She was one of the first people to leave Spalding and go home, one of the first to go back to work. She actually returned to work part-time. She works in human resources for Raytheon. She went back in August. And one of the first to start getting back to things like paddle boarding, actually, and late that summer, and finally, ultimately running. She got back to running using a specially designed prosthetic for that purpose. And what was wonderful about her rapid progress, aside from the progress itself, was that it happened rapidly enough that we were able, as I said, to be there with her, to see these things happen and see her achieve these milestones and to tell about them in the story. And I think that's one of the reasons that when people read the book, they will often say to us that they expected it to be a very hard read, and in many ways it is a very hard read. But at the same time, people are consistently surprised by how much there is in this story that is hopeful and inspiring in some ways to be close to people who are overcoming these kinds of situations, as Heather has done. Heather's progress has continued. Heather always loved shoes. She was a great fan of high-heeled shoes, and Heather is back to wearing high heels for fancy occasions. She has a different prosthetic that is specially designed to allow her to wear heels. And you would never know in a million years that there's anything different about her in her heels. She has begun to do a great deal of public speaking. I checked in with her briefly yesterday after the jury's decision. She heard the news on her car radio. She was alone in her car, driving back from actually giving a commencement speech at a university in Connecticut. She's been doing quite a bit of that and getting better and better at it, I think. And she said that one of her first thoughts was just how sad it made her, the contrast between the bright, young 21-year-old she had just spent time with earlier that day, so full of promise and excitement about all the possibilities ahead of them, and the 21-year-old who took her leg, who made a different choice about his life and managed to destroy not only his life, but so many other lives as well. But Heather also decided that she wanted to start a nonprofit foundation. She had been doing a lot of speaking in hospitals to new amputees about her journey. And she found that when she was telling them about all the opportunities she had found with these very specialized prosthetics, that she realized that not everyone, of course, has the advantage of a story as well known as hers, and the advantage of many donations from around the world to help her get back to her life. So she wants to, she started the foundation. She kicked it off last month, and she hopes that she'll be able to help other amputees to reclaim their own lives with some financial support. So her story has been a very gratifying one to be close to. And, at the same time, there are people who are at all different places in their recovery. There are people who still struggle. Heather went back to Boylston Street for the first time just a couple of months after the bombing. She went back for the reopening of Forum, the restaurant where she'd been when the explosions happened. The building was very badly damaged, had to be closed for a period of time. And when they reopened, they asked her if she would come, and many of her friends who were with her that day had grave reservations about going back and said, "No, Heather, I don't know if we really need to do that." And Heather thought about it, and she decided that she really did want to be there to try and create a positive memory in that place, and also to try and fill in some of the gaps in her memory, things that she couldn't remember or that she misremembered. So she went back. It was a good night for her. But at the same time, Shayna Katong, the young police officer, Shayna managed to go almost a full year without ever setting foot back on Boylston Street. She just didn't, she felt like she couldn't do it. Until finally the marathon in 2014, she went back for the marathon. She was with one of the people whose life she had helped to save. And again, it was a good day for her. She felt good about it. But I think one of the things that we've learned in telling what is a very human story is how differently every person processes these kind of events and copes with them and tries to move forward in their own different way.
And you can see that, I think, in some of these last photos that I just want to show you. And certainly there was a great effort among the running community to kind of reclaim running and marathoning. I think there was a question a lot of marathoners had when this happened, like, kind of, why us? Like, why? We don't get it. This makes no sense. And then it, of course, became apparent that this was not an attack on running a marathon. This was just the venue that they had chosen, right? But there was a real effort afterward to kind of have these memorial runs and to get people to sign up for them. There was a concern early on that now people would shy away from mass running events, but in fact the opposite proved to be true. Many more people were signing up for them across the country, including the Boston Marathon of 2014, which was, as many of you know, which was a huge event. They had to turn tons of people away. The actual day of that race was an amazing day. The weather was just about perfect. It was a little hot for running, but for watching it was perfect. And then, there have been these relationships that have kind of endured. This is Carlos Arredondo and Jeff Bauman at Fenway Park during the playoff run that fall. They have remained close. Jeff has his own book and has kind of been an inspiration in his own right. And then you have the Campbells. This is them at the memorial. The day it was taken down. They've had a really tough time, with the loss of Krystle, who, as Jenna said, was such a huge presence. I think I read this morning that they were satisfied with the verdict yesterday, correct? But they were very private people. They had kept a very low profile. This was very hard for them. You can see just the anguish on their faces. And then, of course, the Richard family. This is Jane going out to sing the national anthem from the playoff game. And then that wonderful moment in, I think it was October, I don't remember if it was October, early November, when the Red Sox had the victory parade through downtown Boston, and they paused to put the World Series trophy on the finish line. I'm just going to close with a quick story that I like to tell from the book, and then we can take some questions that you might have about the book or the trial. I mean, we're here, it's quite remarkable the timing that we're here right after the big verdict yesterday, so I'd be happy to talk about that in the trial. But the story I want to close with is about a woman named Allison Byrne who was ran the marathon in 2013, and she, unlike a lot of marathoners, kind of hated marathons and was not one of these people who lived to run the next one. She wanted to do it, and she wanted to kind of get it behind her, but she did not love it. Nonetheless, she made it very far that day. She made it all the way down to the side of Boylston Street, and was just on that home stretch when the first explosion went off, and she saw it up ahead. And she didn't quite know what it was, but she knew enough to know it wasn't something good. And so as she's starting to run toward the finish line, she's starting to veer away from Boylston, from that side of Boylston Street where the bombs were. And just as she's doing that, the second explosion goes off right near her. And the force of it sort of pushes her across the street into these metal barricades on the other side. And a huge piece of shrapnel the size of like an iPhone lodges in her left calf. And she's lying there, on the street, and she's not feeling like, there were a lot of these stories of people kind of jumping in heroically to help. And there were certainly a lot of those, but in that moment, Allison was not feeling that. She was seeing people run by her, and just out of, fear, and she felt alone and helpless, and she's there bleeding a lot from her leg, and she starts to worry that she's going to die, laying right there on Boylston Street. And eventually, a woman named Nancy, a retired ER nurse, comes up to her. And Nancy was not working that day. She was just there at the race with her husband and I think 2 kids, I can't remember. But she was there as a spectator, and she came over to Heather and to Allison and said, it's okay, I'm not going to leave you, I'm here to help you. And in that frenetic few minutes, a lot of the ambulances were full. There was some confusion about there being 2 sites of 2 different bombs, right? So a lot of people at the second site were kind of being passed by. And so the only vehicle that they had available was a police car. And so Nancy, the nurse, is helping Allison into the back of a police car to go to the hospital. And keep in mind where this is happening. I mean, Allison, this woman who hates marathons, has just run, 26.05 miles or something. I mean, she can literally, the finish line is right there. She can see it, but she hasn't crossed it. And so she actually says to Nancy, and this is even as she is worried about losing her life, in that moment she says to Nancy, in all seriousness, do you think you can carry me across the finish line? And, it seems crazy, right, to be worried about that in that moment, but the mindset, and particularly your brain is all messed up because you just run 26 miles, right, and you sort of have this one goal. So in her mind, it was a perfectly logical thing to ask, even as her leg was bleeding profusely. And Nancy, of course, very wisely being the nurse, says, "You know what, honey, I don't think so," and puts her in the police car and takes her to Boston Medical Center. But I love that story because I think it really captures the kind of the marathoner spirit, or maybe the marathoner sort of craziness, if you want to put it that way, just that single-minded focus on one goal. So why don't we stop there? I know some of you probably have some questions, again, about, we're happy to answer anything about the book, or about the people, or about the trial, or about the verdict. I'd be curious to see what people thought of what happened yesterday, and if it was surprising, or if it was expected, or what. So ask away. Yeah.
Hi, I moved here from Boston, moved there in '78, moved here in November in front of a snowstorm. But it was gratifying to see all the images and stuff. I guess my question is, and I may or may not be part of the book, but one of the things that resonates with me was just a piece of the fabric of the Boston Marathon always being what you said, that joyous spring thing. But I also remember that day Mayor Menino, I didn't know how much you had talked to him or interviewed him, that he actually, it was so him that he like left the hospital to get there.
Right.
Because he was just the kind of guy where you couldn't live in Boston for very long without him showing up. So I just thought, I was just wondering what comments you had on and that also it's a sadness that he's gone, you know. So just, if you had any comments about any interactions with him or interviews with him, or, I know he wasn't a pivotal role, but just that he was there, the way he tended to be there for almost everything.
I'm really glad that you bring him up, because it's just such a pleasure to reflect back on him and his long tenure. He was very generous with us, and I was able to sit with him for a couple of substantial interviews for the book. And of course, having no idea, you know, that these would be, you know, the last conversations that I certainly would ever have with him. And you're right, that is, it's such a great moment where he had just undergone surgery on his leg. So he was in the hospital, and he loved the marathon, and he would go every year, and he would spend hours, you know, just watching the people finish, and he wasn't able to be there, which was hard to begin with for him. And then this happened, and as you say, he described, you know, how he just knew he had to be there, he had to get out of the hospital, and the doctors were saying, absolutely not, you cannot leave the hospital. And he, like, I'm trying to remember the details, he sent one of his staffers into a supply closet at the hospital to get a sheet so that he could drape the sheet over the, like, the catheter so that nobody would see it.
To hide the catheter.
Yes. Yeah, so he stole a sheet from the hospital and fled the hospital against their direction. And as much as possible, he was, from that moment forward, you know, right at the forefront of what was going on. And it was, just as it was heartbreaking for everyone, for him it was a very difficult thing. He talked to me a little bit about what it was like just after 9/11, when he found out the two planes had taken off from Boston, and how difficult that was for him to come to grips with, and how he remembers thinking then, my God, will there come a day when the attack is on my city, and that this day was the day when that actually happened. And you know, I feel very lucky to have been able to talk with him a little bit about all of this. I don't know.
I was just going to say, I think he was so, Tom Menino was so shrewd, you know, politically, and he had such a feel for people. That was his secret sauce all that many, many years, right, leading Boston. And I think he recognized, as silly as it seems, I mean, symbolism in these really difficult moments is really important, right? And people look to their leaders, to, you know, spiritual, political, whatever, to kind of be a reassuring presence. And I think he got that intuitively. And which is not surprising, knowing him, but I think him getting himself out of the hospital, being at that service and standing up on the cane, even though he wasn't supposed to, I think he knew that just seeing him sort of present and fight through the pain in his own sort of personal struggles, to be there and to represent the city was a really inspiring thing. And in some ways it's sort of sad that that was kind of the bookend of these 20 years he had in office, but it was, in a way, it was sort of fitting that he was there to play that role.
Yeah, I just, from my point of view, it was very emotionally reassuring.
Yes, I
think for a lot of the public to see him there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Other questions?
I'd like to thank you very much for coming. There's a few of us here that have some skin in the game, and it means a lot. As a footnote, just before the 14 rioting, we had the terrible fire at Beacon Street. So the city was really crushed in two ways. And spirit and the actual day of running on the 14th, it was like a Mardi Gras in Boston. And it was just wonderful. But Boston usually comes out big, and they sure did. And talking about Menino, now we're also pleased that the city has gone to Marty Walsh, and it just seems like the whole good momentum is just going to pour on. And it's a great city. So thank you for coming. I'm glad I bought the book already.
Thank you very much. I mean,
Thank you for being here.
the race in 2014 was, I mean, every part of this, it's, I mean, not obviously what happened, but sort of so much of what happened afterward feels like it was almost scripted. I mean, the World Series championship in 2013 kind of being exactly what everybody needed, and then this incredible race in 2014 that was not only a beautiful day for everyone, packed and high in demand, but it, you know, the Med Keflezighi wins it, right? The first American to do so in many years, and he was very eloquent afterward, talking about the memory of 4 people that had died and how he had run for them. And there's a little bit of, we had the paperback edition of the book just came out in April, and that allowed us to go back and get in a little bit of that stuff from 2014 and talk about Med winning and kind of what that meant. So, so thank you very much. Yeah.
Jenna, there's certain mixed feelings about the verdict. Could you address sort of the spirit of Boston the last couple of days?
Sure.
What's the question?
So the question was about the mixed reaction to the verdict and to kind of talk a little bit about the mood or the discussion in the city. I thought it was really interesting to watch some of the reaction yesterday. There were certainly people who were very satisfied with it, and people who were troubled by it, and I think maybe on both sides a little bit of surprise at how it turned out, although I was talking about this with Scott this morning, and he was less surprised than I was, probably.
Just out of ignorance,
Yes.
for those of us who've been under a rock for 24
Yeah,
hours,
sure.
what was the verdict? And I guess obviously you don't.
So as you all, I'm sure, already knew that he was found guilty.
Yes.
Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was found guilty by the jury in the federal trial in Boston. But yesterday afternoon, the jury had been in deliberations on the second phase, the penalty phase of the trial. And so the decision that they faced was whether he should receive life imprisonment or the death penalty. And so they did decide unanimously, as they have to on the death penalty. So, I think among victims, families, and survivors, that it's a diverse group of people. So as you would expect, people on both sides. I'm sure you may all be aware, you may not, that the Richard family, who lost their son Martin, who was 8 years old, and you saw him in the pictures, they wrote a letter that was published in the Globe before the decision, sort of appealing against the death penalty. And I think one of their concerns, or one of their feelings, was that for their surviving children, 2 surviving children who were both there that day at the finish line, that the death penalty has set up a situation where there are likely to be years of appeals in the courts, as there always are, and that for their family, coming obviously from their own very personal perspective, that this will bring these events back periodically, and we will be revisiting all of these things that happened that devastated their family. So I think that, as a parent, I could relate to and empathize with what seemed to be almost a protective instinct that was guiding them, or seemed to be guiding them in some of what they were saying in that letter. But certainly other survivors have expressed a great deal of satisfaction with the jury's decision. So I do feel like how people react to it probably has something to do with how they feel about the death penalty in general. One thing that I found interesting yesterday, we had a reporter who went out to one of the neighborhoods in Watertown where the manhunt took place and where the firefight took place that chaotic night when the MBTA police officer was nearly killed. And he was asking residents how they felt about the decision. And there were some of them who said that they were disappointed that it was the death penalty, not because they felt it was too harsh, but because they felt it was too easy, and they would prefer to see him suffer in a more drawn-out way. So I do think that it's very interesting to hear people's individual perspectives on it.
Yeah, and I think that, the Richards are right. If you know anything about death penalty cases, it's not the case that you get a death sentence and, a couple weeks from now you will be executed. No, it'll be years and years and years. I think the federal government has executed, I forget how many people, but it's like 2 or 3 ever. And so, right, so the Richards are right that their whole thing was if we put him in jail, he gets life without parole, he's gone, right? He's in the supermax prison somewhere, we never hear from him again. If he gets a death penalty, kind of counterintuitively, he's going to be back in the news and back in the news and more trials and more appeals and motions and so forth. So, now they're going to have to face that because that does seem to be the course that we're on, for better or for worse. Yeah.
The question relates to the reason behind what they did. Of course, we read a lot about extremism. So, did you get any layers of the onion off to get a little more about what they did?
So the question is, were we able to kind of peel back the onion at all on this big question, which is the why? Why did they do this? What drove these brothers to do this? And I mean, a little bit, I would say, but honestly, I still think it's a puzzle. I mean, even after the trial, it's not, I was kind of hopeful that when the trial started that we would get a fuller sense of that and a fuller sense of the kind of trajectory of their radicalization. And there was a little bit of that, but it still sort of seems hard to fathom, particularly in Dzhokhar's case, because, at least at one point in his life, not that long ago, he had some things going for him. And, yes, the family disintegrated and he had this evil brother and all these things, but, there are lots of people that are in those, not exactly similar, but are, analogous situations who would never make the kind of decision he did. And I feel like even his kind of lack of really emotion almost at all during the trial, it's very puzzling to me. And so, I wish I could tell you that we really unraveled some, kind of clear path or clear motivation, but it's still a mystery for me. I don't know, do you have any clearer sense now that the trial's over?
Yeah, I feel similarly that I wish there had been more in the evidence that would somehow, I just hear it all the time, every time we give a talk like this, and every time I have a conversation with someone about the book, or about the subject in general, there's just such a human need to try and make sense of it, even while on another level you realize that it's impossible. You can't understand an act like this. But I think it's just one of those essential human needs that we have. And so I do it myself, and I keep turning it around and around, and I think about his father's, all of these factors which on the one hand influence the environment that they were in, and on the other hand really can be seen to have nothing to do with it, because his father had mental illness, and his mother became increasingly religious, and his brother wanted to be a star Olympic boxer, and instead, because of his citizenship status, he was thrown out of contention, and his dream died. But as Scott says, many people have dreams that die. Many immigrants come here and succeed, and many immigrants come here and struggle. And so when I try to put those pieces together and fit them into a whole, I still feel like there's something missing. And I think that will, trouble a lot of us for a long time. And I don't know if we'll ever find that missing piece.
And it's discomforting, I think, in a lot of ways, because you worry about, kind of, like, who else is out there, and is this going to happen again, right? You want to be able to put it in the box and say, oh, okay, now I understand, like, this happened, and that makes him this kind of person, and therefore that led us to this terrible terrorism event. But if you can't totally explain it, then I think there's some element of kind of fear or discomfort that, are there other kids like this who grew up and went to schools in Cambridge and were captains of wrestling teams who were feeling like this, or could be moved to do something like this without enough friction to stop them? That's a very troubling prospect, I think. And I think that's part of, at least for me, why it's hard to, it's so unsatisfying to not have that answer. Yeah.
But isn't that what's happening in this country with young people who have no direction, or no vision of what their life will be? they go off to fight the war in Syria. I mean, it's the same kind of thing, but a little different direction.
It's a great point. So she is talking about how we're seeing the same thing where you're seeing young people from some cities going off. This is happening in Europe even more, but even in the U.S. there are a couple of cases, some cases of people, answering some kind of call on Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is to go and fight in Syria with this group ISIS. And yeah, I mean, there are certainly some parallels there in terms of people not having any kind of reason not to, right, and no future, and they're totally disaffected and disconnected, and economically and socially they're cast aside, or they just have no hope, and so you think, well, what the heck, why not?
This is where the evil comes out.
And I think that is a very frightening thing. And again, I mean, this is a bigger problem in Europe where you have a lot more, you have many more recent immigrants from that country, and a lot of them are marooned in these terrible suburban high-rise, it's terrible. But yeah, I do find that troubling, and I think we all should, from a sort of policy perspective, right? I mean, how do you stop that? And it used to be easy in the old days, in some sense, to be like, well, it's clear who the bad guys were, there's some rogue state somewhere that we could, and yeah, we hid under our desks, but at least you kind of knew what the deal was, and now it feels much more organic and harder to pinpoint, and that's a scary thing.
With that, I think
That was kind of a not very happy way to end.
gives you some food for thought.
On that note.
On that
Great
sad note,
Saturday.
I want to express our deepest gratitude for your presentation and welcome everyone to meet them in the lobby to purchase and have them sign Long Mile Home. I have read it. It is a page turner, even though you know how it ends. You can't put the book down. And it's not something you can read at bedtime. So again, thank you very much.